right, welcome everyone. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your attendance. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Patrick Miller. I am your moderator today. I am CEO of Ampere Industrial Security. With us today, we have Roya Gordon. She is the Security Research Evangelist with Nozomi Networks. We have Bruce Snell, Manufacturing Cybersecurity Strategist with Nozomi. We have Rob Dyson, Partner with IBM Global Security Services. We have Maximilian Korf with Scalence LPE Business Development Lead with Siemens. And we are talking about cyber and operational resilience in smart factories. Supply chain disruptions, worker shortages, competitive pressures, and efficiency demands are accelerating digital transformation in the manufacturing sector. At the same time, factories are facing an unprecedented level of cyber attacks. The challenge is to transform while ensuring operational and cyber resilience. So basically, the gist of this is how do you keep operating even under attack, right? And we're going to talk about some topics for you today. Just for some logistics, if you've got questions, there's a little Q&A button down there at the bottom of your screen. You can send your questions there. We'll attempt to address as many of them as we can during the webinar. And for those that we can't address during the webinar, we'll get to those at a later time, get them to you later. All right, so for the panelists, brilliant people, please check out their bios, get a look at what they've done, understand kind of why you should listen to these smart people. So the first topic let's jump into is just the digital transformation thing. Everybody has heard this. There's this question of, is it happening? When is it going to happen? And some have say it's already happened. Okay, so we're kind of in this weird flux of past, present, and future with the idea. So we've got, obviously the pandemic has had a pretty significant impact on some of these things, but how have the last 2 years forced kind of faster adoption of this? Do you think it has been faster? Do you think it's been slower? And from the pace as well, let's talk about some of the challenges and risks to this kind of Industry 4.0 digital transformation piece. And Bruce, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. The last 2 years, we've definitely seen a big kind of acceleration in plans, right? In fact, a lot of organizations, most organizations have their plans for, disaster recovery, or, if everything, goes to pot today, and we have to all go remote, how do we do that? And I saw a lot of organizations had the plans in place, but the pandemic really stressed those, right? And it kind of showed a lot of shortcomings that folks had in their plans, right? Because there's one thing to, have your plan for transitioning to remote work and, disaster recovery, but another to be faced with it immediately, right? And so the pandemic really forced a lot of transition, and especially on the industrial side, where we had people that were more hesitant towards remote access, being kind of forced to put remote access in based on, the mandates in their areas, or, any sort of shutdown due to the pandemic. So I do think it really forced a lot of industries to move forward their plans that they already had in place.
Okay. Max, Roya, Rob, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I guess what I would say what the past 2 years have taught me is that manufacturing, it just isn't manufacturing. It's pharmaceutical manufacturing, auto manufacturing, hardware device manufacturing. So starting to see how manufacturing plays a role in all these other industries, and then the security implications. So for example, I did a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies around, making the vaccine and anything disrupting those the manufacturing process in that. And down the line, that could have an effect on health, that could have an effect on policy. So, manufacturing kind of reaches out to all these different industries. That's something I kind of saw more so during the pandemic than any other time.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, this whole new evolution around Industry 4.0. If you really think about it, competition alone is going to be pushing all these companies to do something, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, the OEM vendors that are out there are also coming up with new ideas, new techniques to make these environments safer, make the environment higher quality, more productive, and allowing companies to do more with less. I mean, I even see companies exploring ideas of lights out manufacturing, where you don't have any people, just all robotics and so forth. So So it's here, and companies can't avoid it if they want to compete in this market space. And so that's what's driving it. And obviously, that drives everything, right? Is the business side that says, hey, we need something, better, faster, cheaper, all that sort of thing, right? And so you can't, if you want to stay, with your current system, no change, the rest of the world's going to pass you by.
Sure. Right. Right. Maximilian, any thoughts?
I remember seeing in India, we had for the first time, in fact, our Indian technicians, they had a remote factory acceptance test. Yeah, for FAT, they always went to the customers, and there was never a problem. And the customer expected it, that we didn't even know how to do the procedure from remote, but they managed to do it. They prepared it, they talked through with the customer, and then only, I think, 1 or 2 people from Siemens went to the customer and had this medium voltage, there was low voltage distribution panels they installed, and did it from remote. They succeeded even faster than they would have done with all normal travel expenses and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm hearing we definitely had a shift in things like the remote access, because as Maximilian just mentioned, we're finding new and creative ways to actually do things like factory acceptance tests remotely during a pandemic. And the landscape shifted, for example, like pharmaceutical, Roy, you mentioned, was a big target during that window. So certain industries had different risks or challenges during that window. So just by a nod, what are your thoughts? Are we already into the middle of digital transformation, or is it already over?
No, it's not over.
It's not over. All right. Some say we're just starting. So where do you think we are? Are we like are we in the middle of this, or what do you think in terms of kind of our level of progress?
Yeah, I would say that the middle is probably a good point. I mean, it's hard to say, right? Because it's definitely been on the road, but we don't really have an idea of when the end's going to be, right? I definitely have seen more of a push, for sure, within the last 2 years of this transformation into Industry 4.0. And part of that is actually I think we're seeing, and the reason I say we can't say half point, because I think it's coming back onto the vendors, right? So as we're having to deal with, more organizations that require remote access or, lights out manufacturing, from a vendor side, you have to create your products differently, right? You have to be able to have things that can be installed remotely by someone that's not a skilled technician that you can just plug and play, right? So I think there's the industry side, but then I think there's also, from the supply chain side, all of the people feeding into the industry are also adapting to this Industry 4.0 transformation. I think it looks very different. What the end state of Industry 4.0 looks very different today than it did 3 years ago, right? And I think, of course, the pandemic changed a lot of that.
Yeah, I guess to add on to what you're saying, I think, I don't know if we're in the middle or if we're in the beginning, because I think that the digital improvements and just critical infrastructure is due to worker shortages. Everyone's leaving the workforce, and obviously since the pandemic, everyone got comfortable with working from home, and now being forced to go back to work, they don't want to do it. They want to find something else. So digitization is kind of filling in the gaps, and they're like, okay, well, we need to fill in for lack of personnel. Now we got to do more work in order to do it in an efficient way. And I don't know what that looks like in the future, So I think as I guess as the workforce is shifting, I guess we're going to see how the industry kind of tailors to that. So it's very interesting. I think we're probably mid-beginning, approaching the middle.
Yeah, and don't
I would
forget,
concern that.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's all about analytics, right? So, how much, when you say digitization, we're gathering data now from places we never could before. And we're analyzing that data, and we're taking that data offsite into the cloud to do some of this. So the exploration, I think, from all involved in this, area, is just now opening up to new ideas. What can we do with that data? How can we, create new products, new services, like say, get higher quality products faster out the door, just in time, stuff like that.
Well, Rob, you
So-
said two very interesting points. One is collecting that data, and then also the cloud, right? And I think those are two areas that were, I know from the manufacturing side, we're very resistant to both of those things. Even just 2 years ago, right? And I think this remote workforce and this remote access concept has really forced the industry to think differently about how we think about the cloud and how we think about exporting data and handling data.
For
Yeah, but those
chemical
behaviors are
industry,
changing.
Yeah. So to add what Rob said and Bruce, in the chemical industry, you have this Namur Namur collector, it's called. So they try to find ways with IoT gateways to make really sure that there's no way back to influence. So to monitor all the data and collect data from plants, chemical processes, but no way back into the process, to make that really sure. And there is in brownfield existing plants, that is really a challenge, that you can have all the benefits of the new digitalization, and that you get this data out of the factory, but not that you expose not too much to the cyber threats.
Right.
And one thing more that came to my mind with now making some publicity for what comes next here in the IoT arena. Think about digital twin. We are just at the beginning. So using data that you can use for, we call it a digital worker, having a digital picture of the factory, of a plant, and feeding that into maintenance work for augmented reality, for example. This is something we're just at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, as you mentioned, Rob, the digitization, what I'm seeing in general is we had a bunch of analog stuff. All the legacy stuff was all analog. And it took a lot of time and expense to physically run a wire and aggregate some telemetry from these things. So you had to pick and choose what you did. Now, every part of your environment can have a digital component and a sensor, and you can get data out of so many new places. So that creates a very different picture for your operation. All right, so excellent. We set the picture for the environment. We talked a little bit about the legacy environment, where we're going. Let's talk about the cyber threats and vulnerabilities. The threat and the vulnerability. I want to talk about both of those components. So let's first go to, what is the current threat and vulnerability landscape for manufacturing, and is it escalating? Let's start.
So I can go ahead and start. I love talking about this stuff. So I come from a threat intelligence background, so constantly tracking and following what the threat actors are targeting. And I feel like there's a misconception about what they're targeting, right? They're not necessarily targeting industries or going after manufacturing and energy. They're just targeting the vulnerabilities. They're targeting the low-hanging fruit. So when you think of the threat landscape, it's, okay, I'm able to use a scanning tool, gain access. And then after reconnaissance is done, it's like, oh, this company seems lucrative. Now I'm going to steal PII and sell it on the dark web, or I'm going to sell this access to a ransomware threat actor. So the threat landscape, it's very multidimensional. And I know this is conversation for another day, but when you understand how threat actors are like broken up into ransomware and nation state, you kind of get to see the different motives. And once you understand that, you realize no one is really after manufacturing, but there's a lot of access vectors, because now threat actors can access production environments via IT, via IIoT, and then via OT. And then of course, in that IIoT space with all the digitization, that just opens it up for more, access vectors. So again, I never like to say, don't migrate to the cloud and don't develop all these new technologies, but do it in a safe and secure way. And I think that as companies try to do it fast, they kind of forget about the security part and they feel like they'll do it later. But I'm happy that we're having the conversation to show like, hey, you want to be efficient, you want to be safe, but security needs to be a part of that.
Yeah, and I want to add on to Roya's point. I mean, it's almost like, to a degree, cyber criminals are somewhat lazy or opportunistic, I guess you will.
Yeah.
And once something triggers, then they start piling on. It's like when, when the first person ran the 4-minute mile, then suddenly everyone else was running one, right? Well, not me personally, but, the athletes were. And so once an industry or once a type of vulnerability is discovered, then you see huge increase in attacks exploiting that. And if I look at the trends from last year, we looked at, in our research that we did from Nozomi Networks Labs, we had a 21% increase in vulnerabilities, but interestingly enough, is a 13% decrease in the vendors affected and the products affected. So what that's telling you, if you read that from a bigger story, there's more vulnerabilities being discovered for fewer things, right? So once something is discovered to be vulnerable, then people start poking around more and figuring out other ways to get in, right? So it does become very much a target of opportunity. So that once an industry is attacked or once a known supplier is attacked, it starts piling on, right? And so it does become, to Roya's point, it's not necessarily people seeking out a specific vendor or specific industry, but they're saying, oh, this is a way I can get in. There's other ways to get in that we can probably find. Let's go ahead and attack this surface, right? So it's almost like you can see kind of if you look at ICS vulnerabilities as a trend over the past decade, it's like a hockey stick, right? I mean, it starts low at the bottom, and then Stuxnet and others kind of clicked it up into overdrive because now the attackers are realizing where the targets are.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that is correct. There's a few trends though that make the OT environment very different than what we've experienced over the past 30 years. And let's say, the modernization of, say technology in general in our corporate environments. One is it's the critical infrastructure nature of what these industrial environments are. And that critical infrastructure is of high interest to any opponent, nation states, criminal organizations, and so forth. So so they do have a reason, and we do know we're getting into a new era of cyber warfare. You can read about it in almost any country's government publications that they're very worried about that. And they also know that instead of using bombs and soldiers and things like that, hey, from a distance, I can cripple an economy if I take out their power system, or their food distribution, or their water purification. I could go on and on. Every company usually that produces something, it becomes part of this whole critical infrastructure and the supply chain and so forth. And we feel it. We've been feeling it with pandemic. And now we're feeling it, I think from more of a cyber attack perspective. And we're going to see more of that as companies are slow to get on board with their cyber programs in these environments. And I can tell you from experience, our teams have been finding this advanced persistent threat more common than you think.
Mhm.
And you speak of Nozomi, when we find it, usually we're for the first time, putting a sensor on the network, and we've discovered it's there and it's prevalent. And we found places where we find that companies got some traffic that's being sent out of the system to a place unknown. That should be disturbing. So, it's stuff like that. How did that happen? Right. And I'm sure throughout this conversation, we'll talk about how that happened. But this is something every company that has an industrial environment should be concerned about. And this isn't, your traditional broadcast exploit. And there's always going to be that. But I think a lot of this is going to be more targeted. And in a lot of cases, it's targeted in a way that you just don't know whether it's insider threat, or it's they know there's an exploit, a vulnerability that can be exploited, and they do.
Yes, I would like to add another trend we see, Rob, in the non-regulated industries. So in manufacturing, for example, it's a positive trend because we know more about incidents. We have small and medium companies, machine builders who now start to talk about incidents that they suffer from. And that's a big advantage, because otherwise you can't have picture of the whole nation. You can't do the threat picture for a bigger industry otherwise. And we have you can open up the newspapers and you will read every day some kind of new attack that happened. We had it from, for example, a big pump manufacturer in Germany was hit recently, and now they had a much better cooperation also with authorities. Now we see police can help much better. You know who to reach out to, and people are informed. So they are starting to make real business continuity plans, disaster recovery, and that was, I would say 5 years ago, not a topic yet.
Yeah.
And for the audience, they should realize that just because it's not in the newspapers, that it's not happening, because, you know, unlike privacy, where there are laws that says you have to disclose if you've been there's a cyber attack that had access to private data. We don't have that yet in our industrial environment. So there is a reason why a public company that's, trading on the stock exchange does not want everybody to know they just had a cyber attack.
Mm-hmm.
So they try to disclose, they try to hide it as much as they can. And, a lot of times they can't hide it because it affects so many people.
Yeah, I have a fun story to tell about that. So on a previous team that I was on, we were constantly on the dark web, seeing what threat actors were targeting critical infrastructure specifically. And every time there was an ongoing ransomware attack where they would post information on a name and shame site, we would see that. And again, it was a third party, not a customer, not a client, but all of a sudden we start seeing all this data being uploaded, and we're just like, wait a minute, that data is from one of our customers, and it's sensitive, like, upstream, like geological drilling locations, coordinates, like really sensitive things that you probably don't want out there. And we're just like, we don't think our client knows this, because the third party that was in the middle of this attack, they didn't say anything. All of this data was being on this name and shape. It's all happening on the dark web. So, it's not even something that's public. And thankfully, at the time we were working with the Department of Justice, we're able to give those notifications, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot more going on that you don't even see. And I guess how we advised our customer is, hey, make sure you're talking to your third parties. And I know in critical infrastructure, there's just so many third parties, like, how realistic is it to have that communication with every single one of them? It could be hundreds, but it's important, because if they're undergoing an attack where your sensitive data is caught up in that, you should definitely be notified. But yeah, absolutely. It's going on all the time without anyone knowing.
Right. So a good example, and there's a lot of reasons why publicly traded companies don't want to have this information out there publicly if they've been hacked. Some countries are now making breach notification laws, so it is actually trending in that direction. For the very reason is that we need the actuarial data. Otherwise, we're really guessing what protections are working, what protections are not working, what actions are failing or succeeding, and how are the threat actors behaving. Much of this is kind of anecdote and hearsay without real actuarial data. And then you have the examples in the manufacturing space, is one of the best ones, of Norsk Hydro, where a company was very transparent about their actions and what they did about the situation, daily briefings, and ultimately turned out to have a very significant increase in their stock price as a result of an incident. So it always comes down to not what happens to you, but how you handle it in a lot of ways. So
and you should be prepared, because that is not spontaneous. So you must have a kind of disaster recovery plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. In most cases, that is not a spontaneous action. That comes with good preparation and planning, kind of some muscle memory. But what I'm hearing is a bit of a mix from the panelists. Is manufacturing a specific target? Is it not a specific target? Because there was some cases kind of a generalist mention, and in some cases there was a specific mention that manufacturing would be a high value target. What do you think?
I can go ahead and clear that up. I think it's a bit of both. So Bruce, when you talked about the scanning, right? Absolutely. A threat actor is going to use a tool. They're going to scan. They're going to get in there. They're going to do reconnaissance. So, at that basic level, there's no specific target. They're just going after whatever access vector and seeing what they can find. Now, once they figure out, okay, this company seems valuable, right? It's not necessarily based on the industry industry, like we want to target this manufacturing process, but this company, and I'm saying this because on the dark web, when access is sold, they say that the size of the company, the revenue, these are things that lets ransomware gangs know this is lucrative. So again, taking the industry out of it, they're looking at the revenue, the size of the company. They'll say it's the top 10 oil and gas company in the world. So it's a mixture of, there's some kind of targeting, but it's still based on financial gain, not necessarily we want to disrupt a manufacturing process. But on the flip side, if it's a nation state threat actor, they're very different. Sometimes they're not financially motivated and they do want to disrupt processes depending on, market conflicts and stuff like that. And that's a whole different conversation. So that's why I think you just really have to understand what threat actors you're dealing with. And I don't think, we should really get caught up into that, but just kind of focus on, okay, how do we protect our networks from it? But yeah, I think it's a mixture of maybe starting off not being targeted, but hey, this company seems lucrative. Now we're going to go after them.
Okay. All right. So let's shift a little bit to the vulnerability perspective. And we actually have the luck of having some vendors on the call. How are vendors addressing their vulnerabilities in their products? Are they standing up like product security response teams? Do they have some sort of product security department or someone in charge of this, or similar approaches? So what are the vendors doing to solve this problem for the asset owners?
So
Okay.
Yeah, Max.
Roy, ladies first, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to set the stage only because, we as, security research team at Nozomi, we work a lot with the vendors. We discover vulnerabilities and we work with vendors to come out with patches. And then, we don't talk to CISA or release anything until there's an actual patch, because again, we don't want to say, hey, we found this vulnerability, and then we're waiting a couple of months for the vendor to actually come out with a fix. So there's a couple of players in this game, and I kind of want to set the stage because I want to talk about like threat campaigns that are targeting vulnerabilities. So, from the researcher perspective, our responsibility to the industry is to find vulnerabilities, disclose them, work with the vendors. We're trying to secure the community. Vendors, they have the responsibility of developing the fix in a timely fashion. And then the end user and the customer, they have to implement the patch in a timely fashion, right? Now, there are threat actors. In particular, there's this one threat group called the Fox Kitten. They have a whole campaign around targeting vulnerabilities, and they target two specific windows, from when the vulnerability is announced to when the patch is developed, right? They're going to target it because they know what it's going to do. If it's going to give them access, they can manipulate, they can inject malicious code. And then from when the patch is developed and it's released by the vendor, there's that other window where the end user, for whatever reason, takes a little bit of time to implement it. So because there's a campaign around that, there's a couple of things that we can do. And I know, Max, before you get into it, I just had some suggestions. So from the researcher perspective, again, in order to close that window, let's make sure we release the vulnerability when the patch is also released. So at the same time, we're telling the community how to fix this. Vendors, of course, fixing these vulnerabilities in a timely fashion, and then the customer, the end user, putting pressure on the vendors, obviously implementing a workaround if you have to wait a little bit, and then implementing the patch in a timely manner so that we can close that attack window that threat actors are going after.
Thank you.
So we would be very happy exactly that if this conscience grows up in industry and at all parts of the supply chain, because as to add, in fact, how we deal with it as a vendor for mainly PLC, but not only, we have portfolio in all our communication capable products, and you have all intelligent drives today. You have for sure the networking equipment itself. You have process instrumentation devices. Everything communicates now, and we receive from research analysts vulnerabilities. We have this coordinated disclosure procedure, and we are used to deal with that for at least 12 years now, because with Stuxnet we are really hit hard. And but some competitors said you were lucky, Siemens, that you were hit so early, because then we built up this big community of product security system experts. And this PSS community, in fact, is more than 1,000 people right now. And the brightest are typically in this defense, cybersecurity defense department, so the CERT or P-CERT, we call it, product CERT. They act very fast. It's a little bit military kind, you can imagine how they approach our product teams. There is a real strong influence and lever into all R&D groups and product managers. And so we really try to answer fast, bring out fixes fast. In the meantime, we do hold up statements and tell which kind of workarounds we can recommend already. And then we publish advisories. And you can see the number of advisories. It's really on the Siemens pages, product cert, it's incredible. It's always rising. And maybe to mention another thing, in the secure product development life cycle that we have, the product managers and product owners, they also they now link every new firmware release of our products are linked in the in our COS database or Siemens Online system. You see now, okay, for this new firmware release, you should apply it for new functionality, and most of all, you must apply it, and we urgently recommend to apply it because it's a security fix. And you see then the link to the alert, to the advisory, which is fixed with this new firmware. So the product owners, it's really a mentality that has to go, or all development teams, product owner teams. And then comes the point to talk about, we just publish it, but we can't make sure that our customers really implement and do the patch now.
Yeah, and Max, I think you hit on a good point. Well, for one, a side note, I think I tend to think nowadays, I think of patches to anything that I'm running or maintaining as being security. And if there's features, it's kind of an afterthought, right? I think the features are secondary for me. It's the bug fixes that come in, right? But you hit on the point of workarounds, right? And that's something that I've run into a lot when advising on security strategy for industrial side, right? I think from an IT side, if you have you discover vulnerabilities, you can say, okay, well, when's our next patch window? Okay, it's next Sunday, and we can go in and fix these patches, right? But if you're looking from a manufacturing perspective, if you're lucky, maybe that year you'll have that downtime. So I think people need to focus a lot. And this is, in my engagements and my consulting engagements with customers, it's let's figure out where the vulnerabilities are. What are the ones that can be fixed, right? What are the ones that can't, right? Because you're always going to have some piece of equipment that has a hard-coded password in it that you're never going to be able to fix. And then you start figuring out what are the mitigating security controls that you can put in place, right? How can you mitigate the threat versus fix the threat? I think from an IT security side, we always think, let's fix the threat, let's fix the vulnerability, let's fix the issue. But from an industrial side, that you can't always go that route. So you have to think about what's the best level of defense I can establish, and how do I mitigate those threats? So I think it requires from a manufacturing perspective, I think manufacturing security requires a more active engagement really than IT security does.
Bruce, I agree. I think whether you're fixing it or work around, like something has to be done. I know we were looking into nation state threat actors and how they were accessing OT environments, and they were exploiting vulnerabilities that were released by, FBI pins 5 years prior, still accessing those vulnerabilities and launching successful cyber attacks. So you can imagine, like, if those, patches, they go unimplemented, there are threat actors that are still actively targeting it, even like 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later, and then eventually they launch a cyber attack. So yeah, a workaround, something, but yeah, it definitely needs to be addressed.
Well, and it's just good practice, right? Because just because a vulnerability has been discovered on a piece of hardware, it doesn't mean there aren't more vulnerabilities on that piece of hardware, right? Those are just ones that haven't been discovered yet. Right. So as you see, there's 17 new vulnerabilities this year or this month. That doesn't mean that there are new, right? They could have been existing for the entire life of that product, right? Yeah. So I think just from a good practice perspective, it's good to put in those mitigating levels of security in place, because there are vulnerabilities out there on your hardware that you don't know about. And I feel comfortable, in security, I rarely like to give a concrete, this is black or white, kind of answer. But I'm very comfortable saying that, if you have hardware out there, you've got vulnerabilities that haven't been discovered yet, right? And that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I mean, these environments, let's just face it, from a security perspective, are very immature.
Mhm.
I would say it's rare to find a company that has a real security program around their industrial environment. And a security program obviously is, all the NIST components, NIST CSF components, if you're
Mhm.
thinking framework. We have that in our corporate environment. Why? Because we've been focused on it for 30 years,
Right.
but you take that same type of, security program concept and you try to apply it to your industrial environment. It just isn't there. Simple things like roles and responsibilities.
Mhm.
Patching today is exactly the way you guys described it. It doesn't mean it has to be that way, but that's the way it is. And that's because the environment's so immature. I mean, who is going to patch? For one, we find a vulnerability and then it's like, well, okay, who's going to do it? Because let's face it, we do have maintenance time in all these industrial environments. Equipment itself gets out of tolerance or breaks and has to be repaired. If you knew that, hey, now I've got to repair a device and this is my repair window, but by the way, I'm going to throw the patch on at that time. Well, why can't we do that? Well, because we don't have good asset management programs around those devices. Okay, I can go on, and we just need much more than what we have today because the whole environment is immature from a security perspective.
Well,
Yeah.
and Rob, I think to your point, it is immature, but I think we have an opportunity to learn from all of the mistakes that we've made over the last 30 years of IT security and kind of do it a little bit better for this, right? I think so that immaturity does put, the industrial side at risk, but it also provides an opportunity for folks to develop better security strategies and really do things right the first time instead of, oh, now we've developed this new shiny widget, let's install that, right? Like, all of those lessons should have been learned. And I think the folks on the OT security side can really, benefit from looking at the history of what's been done on the IT security side.
Absolutely. And that's why we see the trend of this CISO now being assigned the responsibility for OT security.
Mhm.
They don't have OT experience in most cases, but they get it because they understand what a good security program looks like. And then they just have to make sure they find the right talent to help them, put that program into place.
And Robert, I would say we should come from both sides. Let's say the top-down approach from IT or CISO side, and also from bottom-up. Because when we talk to automation engineers and production engineers, then we really try to make them aware that it's a real threat. There are IoT search engines. You can find PLCs and vulnerabilities, and just do a scan on networks and find which PLCs are online, and you see the make, you see the model, you see the firmware version, and then you can find out which exploits are already there. Yeah. So with the security level 1, I would say advanced script kiddies, they can go quite far in non-protected environments already.
Yeah, don't connect anything to the internet.
or Shodan.io will find out.
Exactly.
Right. Or any of the others as well.
Yeah,
and Rob, you mentioned the NIST CSF for our international partners. There's a lot of IEC 62443 and similar standards out there as well. They've all been mapped together, and honestly, standards are, I'm Italian, it's kind of like Italian food. They're all the same thing. You just mix it up a different way and call it something else. The controls are all there. They're out there. Pick one.
Yeah.
Pick one and work with
we have
it.
customers still shocked if you show them searches and they say, how can that be that this appears here? Whoa. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
And usually the default credentials are found on a manual somewhere on the internet. As
exactly.
Well.
Credentials were not changed during commissioning. You have the standard credentials, and it's so easy to break it. You can change swimming pool temperature. You could open prison gates. Everything was already available.
Right. And I think it's key to mention that though the vendors, I'm seeing a general uptick in the vendors' behavior around developing product security teams, having someone in charge of product security, having a front door where vulnerability researchers can come in and actually deliver vulnerabilities and they respond appropriately. I know Siemens, you're like 3 to 6 months in some cases for something that can be turned around fairly quickly. That's an insanely difficult challenge as a vendor. I understand that. But that said, the onus is on the asset owner to patch or to architect in some way that patching isn't necessary for the moment. But as mentioned in the chat, there's lots of testing that's necessary and many other things. So it's a very complex issue in terms of addressing the vulnerability side of this, the vulnerability component. Okay, let's talk about some resilience. Okay, yeah, let's talk about this. This one is always a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Is I've often used the concept of Hanlon's razor, which is don't attribute malice to that which can be attributed to basically human behavior or accident or sometimes stupidity. So what's the split really in your mind? What's the split between cyber attacks from outside, attackers breaking in, doing bad things with malicious intent, versus somebody on the inside, not an intentional insider attack, but just accidents, just human things?
My opinion is you don't know. We don't know. Look, these environments.
Why do we know? Why do we know?
Well, because I go into a whole pitch on this one, but first of all, you don't know who you hired. Do you really? Do you really know that if you hired somebody that they're not working for somebody else? You don't know. And if somebody really is malicious and they want an insider, they just make sure that they're going to pass a background investigation. They're not working for you. They're working for somebody else. Step one. Step two is it might be both. The insider is helping the outsider get in, right? Because they're helping to open up some of those vulnerabilities to get in. You just don't know. And I would say that for corporate as well. We don't. In the security profession, we'd like to say, oh, we know that this is brute force attack, targeted attack, broadcast. No, we don't know, because what we don't know is the one element of who we hired. We don't know that. You think you know, but you don't know. And I tell you, that's something we all need to be concerned about because of our lack of access controls and our privileged access management that we have in all environments. We need to get tighter on that. And until we do, we're going to have this risk. I guarantee it.
Yeah, it sounds like you're talking about zero trust there, Rob.
I am.
And everybody talking about zero trust.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the answer, right? Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's insider, someone flipping the wrong bit or leaving something on or whatever. The end result is a compromise, right? Or an outage or downtime. And so that's where I've always been very aggressive with my customers when I engage in a consultation and say, look, I challenge you to be as secure as possible, right? Even if I think in the early days, IT security or security in general, we're concerned about not saying no too much, right? I always heard the response of, oh, well, what if my CEO can't get their email? It never happened, right? But that was a big concern. And I think as we see more high profile breaches, more issues going on, I think organizations are being more receptive to having more security controls in place, right? And so that's where I think, I would have said that even 5 years ago, zero trust was a buzzword, right? But I actually see it now as more, of something that a lot of organizations are actively going towards and building in this zero trust architecture to provide that security that is really kind of not bulletproof, but dummy proof, right? It's gonna, if you've got a good working zero trust model, you can go a long way to prevent outside actors, malicious actors from doing bad things, but you can also prevent, unknowingly, misconfiguration from inside and prevent the accidents from happening from your internal employees.
And Rob, you mentioned also not only, I'm very in favor to go in this direction of zero trust and do micro segmentation. But for the start, for many factories, we would be very happy if at least there would be the one perimeter or DMZ between the IT and the OT environment. Sometimes we don't even see that.
Right.
And for sure, we would like to see defense in depth and real cell protection concepts. So with all production cells neatly segmented. And we don't, for insider threats, in manufacturing, we don't, very rarely we see, for example, background checks of employees working there.
Well, there's a lot of third parties, you know, right? There's a lot of third parties, and you just
service technicians coming in.
Yeah, you assume they're going to do the background investigation, and you just know that they're going to come in and do maintenance because they're part of the vendor community, and you're like, okay, you automatically trust them, right?
Yeah, it's very funny. You enter a factory, and if you're a service technician, then they ask you for your notebook, and your notebook is registered, and then you say, okay, this is the number of the notebook, and you go in, yeah, it's registered now, fine. And then you can connect to anything.
I guess I'll say something. I know we're talking about insiders, and I know, Patrick, your original question was, hey, external threats versus internal threats. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of external threats. So from the CTI perspective, we're seeing the tools becoming more complex. So obviously the level of knowledge of the threat actors being less, meaning that there's more of them in the game, you know? So on the dark web, when they're like, hey, we have access to a SCADA system at a nuclear power plant, which is something we've seen, it's kind of like that, the potentiality for that cyber physical effect and the damage that it can cause, you know, and then again, anybody can get their hands on it. It's like, you know, the dark web is like, I call it like a Build-A-Bear, right? You don't know anything about cyber, but you're going to get network access here, and then you're going to buy this ransomware, and then you're just going to deploy, and that ransomware is going to do whatever. I think that's very dangerous because there's a lot more threat actors doing that. So I know that there's a focus of zero trust and, you know, making sure that internally we're minimizing the mistakes and the insider threats, but I'm just seeing just way more threats from the outside coming in. So I just kind of wanted to throw that perspective out there.
Right. And I think in general, and I think most can agree, by employing more security visibility, more security tools, zero trust methods to keep that resilience and that reliability up, like whether it's ransomware or an internal person maliciously or accidentally causing issues, you get a higher degree of resilience overall from employing these tools, right? It's not just for security, it's also for accidents and malice. Right. It actually solves both in almost all cases. And did want to acknowledge Isaiah's comment about staffing. It is rare for management to pay for quality staff, so you kind of end up with what you end up with. To Rob's point, it's even harder to vet somebody that is not, you know, a highly paid professional, and even then you got to worry about the highly paid professionals. So it is definitely a daunting challenge. But with that, let's talk a little bit about who is responsible for protecting manufacturing facilities from cyber attacks. You know, we just talked about executives fundings for staff. Who do you see really is accountable for this? And this really kind of bleeds into that IoT, IIoT, corporate IT, ops IT, OT. Is it just T? What is it? Who's responsible for this?
That's a loaded question, right?
Yes.
And here's why, because you know, first of all, that question is a question about governance. And so, you know, I'll answer kind of the one way to say that everybody is responsible for security, right? Because we all play a part. But then there are certain roles and responsibilities that have that specifically in their day job, right? And that's why I mentioned the CISO now. That's the trend, is getting more in that responsibility from that, you know, moving the corporate and industrial environment, if a company has both. And then, you know, you need a RACI. And anybody that's ever worked with me will know that I mention RACI at least 20 times a day. And, you know, and nobody has one, you know, and if they do have one, it's not current. But, you know, all the way from an asset owner to a process owner, you know, because if I'm going to try to handle an incident, okay, now I've identified one, I have a vulnerability, it's been exploited, it's a cyber attack. Who do I call to help me mitigate that? If I don't have that pre-established from roles and responsibilities, I'm going to tell you what, it's going to take a long time to mitigate that particular cyber attack, and it may be too late.
I do want to say I'm a fan of outsourcing, right? I do think obviously it's security is everyone's responsibility, but if you have like a dedicated SOC, a dedicated incident response, a dedicated team that's going like it's their day job to do that, I think that's better than trying to figure it out within the company. So for example, there was a large oil and gas company, they reached out saying, hey, we want to build a threat intel program. So we're just like, yeah, let's do it. And we're just like, whoa, like we're starting this from the ground up. You don't even have personnel. Like, let's just outsource this. You know, there's a team, we can manage your SOC, put a incident response team on retainer, and then you can focus on the operations of the business and the OT environment, and you don't have to worry about security. So again, everyone's outsourcing everything. We're moving to the cloud. Why not just outsource your security? And I think that'll just it'll just alleviate a lot of the responsibility, the stress of having to know how to do it. So that's kind of, I guess, my advice.
Well, and Roya, that leads into, I mean, the fact that we've got, you know, a huge skill shortage, right? There's a tremendous amount of open IT security jobs, you know, in the US and globally. And this is something that, you know, hasn't slowed down over the pandemic. So finding those good people that can manage your SOC 24/7 are really difficult. I was having a conversation with the CISO at a Fortune 10 company, and he said, look, there's probably 200 good SOC people in the US, and we're all fighting over them, right? So trying to build it yourself is really difficult. And it's almost, I mean, I think we can actually take cues from, you know, the Industrial Revolution itself, where, you know, historically, you know, a factory had to build their own power plant and had to have, you know, all of these other things that now are they're modern utilities that feed those in, and you know, you don't have to deal with that, right? So it's kind of, you have to take the same approach. And having those outsourced folks can really help, you know, provide that 24/7 coverage, because ultimately, you know, the attackers aren't going to happen, you know, between 9 to 5, right?
Yeah.
And then when you get the really good people in your environment that, you know, if you take a SOC analyst, for example, if you have a really good SOC analyst, he's not going to want to work at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, right? Because he's going to go find some other place to work where he can work a 9 to 5, right? And so it really does, you know, outsourcing really makes a lot of sense these days when you look at, you know, being able to staff 24/7 to protect against the new threats that are out there.
Yeah, and I see
Absolutely.
critical infrastructure companies just trying to save money, but they're trying to, I feel like you should be trying to invest money. So, you know, they came to the consulting firm, you know, to consult. We said, hey, we can do this for you. And then they pretty much took that and said, we can do it ourselves. So it wasn't even like, you know, they couldn't find a team to do it. It's like, hey, we don't want to spend all that money. We want to do it ourselves. And again, you know, cutting corners, invest in cybersecurity. It's not something to cut back on, because when you're hit with a ransomware attack or whatever, then you're going to be paying $4 billion in ransom. So,
Yeah. Max?
This question of responsibility, what I wanted to add, Patrick, is there's some misconception, at least at the non-regulated, again, non-critical infrastructure companies. So quite often in manufacturing, we see that in the supply chain, the asset owners tend to believe, okay, this is a very good machine that I got from my machine builder, and they believe that, so the machine builder must be now responsible, or the system integrator, that this machine is secure because it must have been delivered secure. So that is misconception which comes between the difference between safety and security. So at least we know that we see that the machines that are delivered in a safe way. So for safety, it's always in the CE marking, for example, in Europe, that it must be really the machine builder who did this safety concept before. And then it just brought to market, installed at the end customer, and never touch a running system. That's then the conception. But if you think about security, that's for sure. There are some lots of requirements you can put to the supply chain. You can ask to the machine builder. He should bring up fixes for the vulnerabilities, and he should do it during the first 2 years, for example. He should do it free of charge. That's always a question to negotiate, for sure. But later on, you should always you must have the right attitude that it's always, in fact, the asset operator's task, and be aware of it. and detect vulnerabilities too. Protect and detect.
Right.
Protect
then
and
respond.
detect. I like it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we talked a little bit about the outsourcing, and I do agree. Basically, if this isn't something that you do well, and if you're not going to be able to match your adversary's skill set, hire someone who can. Just outsource it. Yes, you will still need some of your internal staff. Yes, they'll still need to call somebody, but you'll get less calls, and you'll have less frustration and less burnout internally trying to chase down these false positives because someone else gets paid to do that.
Right.
It's just, it does make sense. And
It's not part of the education. You know, you can't wait for a generation to come. In fact, that they understand how to automation, for example, automation engineers, they did not have it in their whole course syllabus that they followed at university.
Right.
So networking starts to be included, but not network security yet. So it's a huge problem. You need, for some tasks, you really need IT security experts.
True, true. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. So I want each of you to take basically about a minute because it's all we have. And I would like you to leave us with at least one practical tip or takeaway for the folks about resilience. And when we're thinking about resilience, you know, this is how to keep operating through an attack. So let's start. Let's see, Bruce, you're at the top of my list on my little screen here. So, and we also have a poll. So if you could, people in the background, respond to the poll while our panelists are answering. What's like the number one thing you would say to do for resilience?
Yeah, I think it's an easy answer for me. I think the number one thing is identify your assets, right? Because the number one issue I see continuously is that people don't know what's in their environment. There may be ghost systems that are sitting out there. There may be a Raspberry Pi that somebody installed underneath their desk. So if we're looking at building towards, you know, even a zero trust model, the first step is identifying what's out there. Because if you don't know what's out there, you can't do an accurate risk assessment. So all of these things, all of the advanced security steps that one would take to provide a good, solid security program starts with finding out what you have. And I think that's a step that's dramatically overlooked.
Right. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. Yep.
Exactly.
Okay. Maximilian, you're next in my little set of faces here.
And say again, please. That was.
Yeah, it's Max, your turn.
So any recommendations we give is that our customers, we tell them, please try everything to be aware of the problem, do awareness trainings for your staff, and think about the whole chain of protection, detection, and reaction to cyber attacks. Because what we see quite often is they think, okay, if I have good suppliers, or if I do some kind of point security somewhere in my network, then they think of something, invest in some special item, but afterwards they lose the full picture.
Right. Roya, you're next.
Yeah, so I would say definitely be on top of threat intel. You know, anytime there's a ransomware, malware, malicious actors out there, like there needs to be someone that's on top of, okay, this is a bad IP, this is a file, you know, hashes, malicious emails, a website. I think there needs to be someone, if not anything else, on top of blocking those things from the network. Because again, you know, threat actors have been around for a long time. And I think, and I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, but I think that when we see these new threat actors, they're just old ones that reemerge, they're rebranding because, you know, they want to kind of confuse us a little bit. And then also when you're blocking those IOCs, you can figure out attribution later because these threat actors, they're using different tools, you know. Sometimes there's North Korean nation state threat actors using the tools of the Iranians and, you know, don't get caught up with all that. Block the IOCs, figure out attribution later. But I think there definitely needs to be prioritization in that.
All right, Rob, real quick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just glue it all together, you know, have visibility, you know, as Bruce said, visibility into your environment, know your environment, you know, people and the process. Definitely want to know, you know, what your threat landscapes are and your vulnerability, and then, you know, train, create that RACI and train every individual over and over again. So if there's an incident, they know what their role is and what they need to do to participate to get back to business as usual.
Fantastic. All right, I heard asset management, security awareness, threat intelligence, and visibility of people and process. Those are some key elements for resilience. All right, well, with that, I'm going to close this out. Thank you so much for our panel. Brilliant, brilliant advice. I hope everybody on the call, on the webinar enjoyed, and we thank you for your time. So thanks so much, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of the event today. So there's lots of good content.
Ciao. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Thank you.